Okay, part two of our final end of the year project and my final project ever. I told you at the end of the last one I was going to talk about that paper I have it right here, and I've sent it to you, and I'm going to have it up on the screen in a minute as it's scrolling through. That tells you all about the anatomy of a scare story. I always like doing this at the end of the year. We kind of pull everything together after watching a lot of videos, some of which you guys did get to see, some of you didn't. I'm going to talk about those today as we go over this. All right. But I've broken it down, as you can see, scrolling past you, is I've broken it down into three parts. There's the beginning, which is the bad science. Usually that's what it starts with. Anecdotal data, testimony is going to talk about that. Preliminary studies in junk science and people doing epidemiology. Then there's the way it expands from that, the proliferation of this, the getting the word out. Obviously, the internet and the media are the two biggest ways this happens. And some of these old videos, the internet wasn't even an issue. There was no internet. Like in the early 1990s, people just didn't use it like they did now. And some of our videos go back that far. And finally, the defense, that's the biggie. I'm not going to talk about that any more than I'm going to talk about the other ones, but it's one of my favorites because it really does illustrate how all these have this same pattern. And I think all scare stories do. You're going to probably see it in this one. And when I call this a scare story, I want you to realize it doesn't mean that it's not necessarily scary. It doesn't mean that it's a hoax, but it clearly is a scare story. You're scared. I mean, most everybody has been scared of, like I said, everything from getting the mail to going to the grocery store. I mean, you've been scared. And so the question is, were you scared senseless? Were you scared out of your wits for no reason? And what should we have done and what could we be doing now and in the future? And I want you guys to look that up. Now, I'm going to try to, as I go along each of these things, I'm going to try to basically not only talk to you about our old videos, which I said I was going to do, and bring in how each of these parts is illustrated, but I want to show you how things I've seen, at least with this one going on, this new scare story, the COVID-19 one. I want to talk about how I've seen the exact same things happening. But I've never seen a snowball like this, honestly, in my life. I've seen a lot of scare stories, seen a lot of crazy things happen. I remember when Ebola, people were so scared to death over Ebola. I remember anthrax, believe it or not. After 9/11, there was some white powder sent in the mail to some congressman or something down in the South. I can't even remember it, but I'm not kidding you. My mother would not open her mail. I mean, that's just, there's been a lot of these scare stories, and of course, the ones we talked about in the videos. So, as I go through these, I'm going to try to show you how I definitely see pattern here. The same exact pattern. You're going to see the similar things that are happening for this one that I saw happen for all those other scare stories. So, you make what you want of it. I know you're probably not going to do the paper like I said, but I think most of you probably want to know the truth here because you're living in this stuff. You're the ones who, if this continues, aren't going to get to graduate. You're not going to have a graduation ceremony. You're not going to have a prom. You're not going to be able to date. If you can't even play with your friends, basketball or sports, how are your parents ever going to let you date someone? All right, you got to get within 6 feet, pretty much. All right, so I'm just saying this actually will affect you. You might want to actually look this stuff up on your own when you get it or when you get your chance. Again, I don't expect to be handed a 9-page paper. If you do, I'll read it. But I don't expect to be handed one from most of you. I do expect that you'll look for these same things as you're looking stuff up online, and as you get these memes, and as people are arguing on Facebook over this stuff, maybe you'll have something to add to that conversation besides just passing the meme along that happened to be funny. All right, so let's start with the very first part, the beginning. The beginning has 3 parts to it, 3 different ways that these things often get started. And the first one is anecdotal data and testimonials. What does that mean? All right, well, many of the scare stories in the past began with particularly frightening accounts of a disease, and usually it's linked to some event or toxin, or in this case, a virus. All right. Often you get the most tragic and pathetic stories are shown in the media. All right. And basically, they seem to imply that there's a linkage there. Now, obviously, this is not exactly the same for the COVID thing. We know what kills people from COVID. We know viruses do kill people. We know that. But a lot of the ones in the past was a question of whether the EMFs were causing cancer or the breast implants were causing connective tissue disease. So back then, it was a little bit different than this, but you still see the same thing. Anecdotal data and testimonials with the most sensationalized, tragic cases to try to make their point. But it doesn't prove causality in the case of these scare stories. And honestly, it doesn't really make a point if your point is trying to be made about what we should be doing about the virus. Just scaring people and just throwing out the worst case scenarios and the poor, pathetic people who happen to have died and spending entire shows on it and showing crying babies is not really the way to get to the science. Okay, now that may sound cruel, but it's a fact. If you want to actually see what's going on, you can't do this. And you saw this now. I'm going to point out some of the ones you saw in the past with that's right, you guys didn't see that one. The one in the Gulf War syndrome. There's a guy who developed Lou Gehrig's disease. Well, nobody knows what causes Lou Gehrig's disease. I mean, there's no cure for it. But a guy came back from the Gulf War. He had Lou Gehrig's disease, and of course he and his wife, because he really couldn't talk much, he's in a wheelchair, believed that it was the Gulf War, going to the Gulf War, that did it. All right, and there was another guy who came back from the Gulf War who had a child who was born with no arms or legs. Actually, the legs were there, but he had to amputate them. And the hands were connected at the shoulders. And Life magazine put this guy on their cover, implying that as a country we have abandoned our veterans. Now, if you look at that picture, that's a pathetic picture. It's a horrible picture. There was more of it in the video if you had seen it, of this poor child and the mother crying. And I'm not trying to make light of it, but it doesn't prove that Gulf War causes birth defects. In fact, all the studies that they did after the Gulf showed there was no higher incidence of birth defects from veterans and from non-veterans, or from veterans that went to the Gulf and veterans that didn't go to the Gulf. There just wasn't there. There was no connection, just like there's no connection between Lou Gehrig's disease and the Gulf. Same thing happened with the connective tissue diseases and rheumatoid arthritis and lupus that was supposedly linked to breast implants. Again, if you look at the actual stats, it's not there. The studies were done. Hundreds of studies were done, of thousands and thousands of people, and it just weren't able to show it. But again, you would see the most pathetic cases, all right, that would try to show you, and if you remember, the entire EMF video was of a family that was basically, actually several families that had children who had childhood leukemia or cancer or something. And the problem with that is the one woman there in tears is talking to the camera, and I was just blown away by all the bald-headed babies I was seeing in the cancer ward. Well, like I said at the time, that's not science. The fact that there are so many bald-headed babies in the cancer ward isn't surprising, because that's where all the cancer babies are. They're in the cancer ward. You have to do a study, a real study, to be able to prove it. And just showing this poor woman who's obviously in pain does not prove your case. It does make it a lot easier for you, because the other side's gonna have a hard time. They're not gonna be like me. They're not gonna be like me, a mean, callous person who's gonna point out that I feel real bad for you, but that doesn't make your point. Most people are just going to say, "Oh, that's terrible." I agree. It probably was that. It probably was, because who wants to argue with the mother who's grieving, right? So that's the problem with the anecdotal data and the testimonies. There are lots of examples in the videos we saw between the breast implants, the EMFs, the Gulf War syndrome. All of those were the worst case, not just worst case scenarios, but actually in some cases just pathetic cases that you couldn't really argue against, because it would make you look horrible. It would just make you look like a bad person. All right, and that's one of the problems with how these stories begin, because you can't argue against that. All right. Now, the second way the scare stories often begin. Oh, by the way, just to finish that one up, again, I'm not making the argument like some of these fit better to COVID-19 and some don't. Obviously, I believe that using those kind of people, like showing every single nurse or every single respiratory therapist who happened to die from this disease, and the funerals for these people is not, and posting it online and with all these, that's not really science. It's not telling us that if you're a friend of yours, then it's a tragedy to you, no doubt about it. All right. And so obviously I feel bad for you. But the fact is, that doesn't prove your point about, well, that's why we have to all wear masks. And that's the next statement. That's the very next statement out of these people. See this person over here? See how pathetic she looks? You want to argue with her? Then put your mask on. That's not an argument. All right. You better make your argument based on stats, facts, figures, science, not based on how pathetic a story you found online. All right, so that's my point of that first one. Now, the second way it's done is through preliminary studies and junk science. And again, let me go. This time I'll go through the old stuff first, and then I'll talk a little bit about how I've seen a little bit of that with the COVID-19 stuff as well. All right, if you remember in the EMF video, that Swedish study. Do you remember that Swedish study that studied like the entire population of Sweden practically? And they found that over 4 times the risk of childhood leukemia. So immediately the government like, okay, let's shut this down. We're going to move kids away from power lines. We're going to move schools. We're going to move everything. You know, we're going to make some major decisions here. All right. But it was a preliminary study. All right. And it turns out there were a lot of problems with it. One major problem, if you remember, is they measured 800 risk ratios in that study. And then they only reported the one that happened to be high. Well, you can't do that. And my analogy for that was, if I measured 800 things about your class, I asked you 800 questions. Who was your mother's name, your father's name, your mother's maiden name? Would find something that was weird. That's the way things go. You can't measure 800 things looking for something. You have to decide, okay, this is what I'm looking for first. That's how good epidemiology works. And then you do your study. All right, we see the opposite of that with the Texas sharpshooter in the EMF ones. All right, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But I want to come back to the Swedish one. Here's the crazy part, and this is something you guys can't really get your head around. Even if that Swedish study were true, and there really were 4 times the risk of childhood leukemia from being around a power line, would it make more sense to move those kids away from the power lines? So of course it would. You'd save kids. You'd save lives. Would you? Well, let's think about that. If moving the kids requires them to be out of school for a whole year while they build another building, and busing them an extra mile or 2 to school, that's going to kill people. The safest place you could be is in school, number one, and driving is like the most dangerous thing we do all day. So this is a very tenuous example, but the fact is, there are consequences to those actions. So, would more of the kids be harmed by moving them away from the power lines? You say, well, how many people are going to die from driving a little bit further or building a building and keeping kids out of school for a while? Well, that's the thing about statistics. I told you I'm going to talk about statistics in this one too a little bit. All right. The crazy part about this is, even if the actual study were true, okay, say the study that with 4 times the greater increase of childhood leukemia were true, and how many more kids would that mean would die? About 1 in a million. So, well, that's not possible. He said 4 times. Yeah, because childhood leukemia is very rare. So the number of kids that would actually die in Sweden would be about 1 more per million. So the question then becomes, would you kill or harm more kids, more than one in a million, by doing these things? Now, that's why, you have to always look at the unintended consequences. Much the same can be said for this current pandemic. Is the shutdown doing more harm than good? That's something you need to look up. You need to find out the statistics. They're just starting to come in. It's for you to determine that, okay? But putting 30 million people out of work doesn't just affect some nebulous thing called the economy. It doesn't just affect the rich fat cats and the impersonal oil companies who are losing a few profits. It has real effects on real people, okay? And it's not a bogus question to ask that, if whether shutting the economy down will save or harm more people. But if it saves just one life is the obvious answer, the obvious retort to that, right? If it saves just one life, if one more person is saved from coronavirus, then it will be worth it. But the question is, how many other lives had to be sacrificed to the effects of this shutdown, like increased suicide, drug addiction, alcohol abuse, child abuse? I have been looking up, I'm not looking them up for you. You look them up online, because a lot of the stuff is preliminary. That's the problem with being inside of the scare story while it's going on. Ones I've given you in the past, that's hindsight. Hindsight's 2020. You're in the middle of one right now. And so it's not going to be so easy to figure it out. All right, but you should look it up. How much have suicides gone up? How much has calls to suicide hotlines gone up? I've seen some stats, local stuff, and online. I don't know how true it is yet, but it seems like a lot. Drug addiction, alcohol abuse. I do know one stat for sure. Child abuse calls to the child abuse hotlines are way down. If you live in a lousy house, if you live in a house where you can't even sleep at night because you're not safe, because your family, if you want to call them that, is so bad, drug addicted and gang related, or in a dangerous neighborhood, you're now spending 24 hours a day in that environment. Can't tell me that there aren't kids who are dying because they're home. And if you think that that's not happening, you're going to find that that's not going to be the case. When we're all done with this, you're going to find that over the course of this whole COVID shutdown, we have, I don't know if it will be more harm than good, but I do know there will be harm. All right, there is definitely going to be harm. The statistics are already starting to come in, but we are still in the middle. I can't tell you, look it up. I'd like to see that. If somebody were actually, not just brave enough, but enthusiastic enough to do this, a paper, I'd love to see what you find out. Okay, you're welcome to share that with me at any given time. All right. Okay, now that brings me to the last way that these things begin. And that's through the lay epidemiology. Now, you've been hearing that word epidemiology. I bet you're happy if your parents ever, Dr. Fauci's an epidemiologist, or Dr. whatever is an epidemiologist. And you knew what that word meant, or at least if you were paying attention, you knew, because we saw it. Very first video we saw was on EMFs, and that was all about epidemiology. I made you define it in a worksheet, okay? There was a good reason I made you do that. I knew that whenever there's a thing like this, there's always epidemiologists that we go to. But people, lay people, average everyday people trying to do epidemiology, that's when things go wrong, okay? So if you remember the EMF video, this was the biggest theme there. Those mothers in Nebraska, they did their own study, documenting cancer cases and drawing circles around zip codes and saying, look at all the cancer incidents near these power lines. That's not the way science is done, because remember the Texas sharpshooter analogy. You cannot shoot first and then draw your bullseye later. Okay, that's what they were doing. That's not how epidemiology is done. That's why almost all cancer cluster investigations turn up nothing, because it's just a couple of people who get together. We're in the same block. Oh, I've got rheumatoid arthritis. Oh, so do you? It must be because we both work at the same plant, or we both live in the same block, or we both live near a nuclear power plant. That's just natural to do, but it isn't science. To do science, you got to say, okay, I think living near the nuclear power plant causes rheumatoid arthritis. And then you do a study. You do an actual study, and you say, I'm going to take some random power plants. I'm not going to just go where I already know they're there, because that's like walking up to the barn where I already shot. And I'm just going to draw my circle and say, hey, look how good a shot I am. I had a bullseye. Okay, that's the Texas sharpshooter analogy. So I'm going to talk about the statistics in this one as well, because the lay epidemiology really does throw those lousy statistics in there a lot. Okay, and it's very easy to fall into this trap, even if you're not a lay person. You can even do it as a professional, and we saw that in the movie as well. Okay, the Swedish study, like I mentioned earlier, where they basically measured, so it was called the multiple comparisons fallacy. They measured so many things, but they only reported the ones they wanted to. All right, but really, manipulating statistics, sometimes it's just done by accident, but sometimes it's done on purpose. And I want to talk about that a little bit too, because it's a full-time job for partisans on either side of an issue. So if you remember the Stossel video, where certain groups were claiming that violent crime was up over the last few decades. Well, that's just not true. By even any professional person you ask about this would say that's not true. But it's easy to scare people with those numbers. How do they do it? Well, they just didn't adjust for population growth. Are there more murders and rapes now than there were 40 or 50 years ago? Yes. Are there more percentage-wise to the number of people in the United States? No. It's been dropping since the 70s. All right, it's leveled off. It dropped precipitously for like decades. It leveled off, maybe it goes up a hair, it goes back down. It's basically been level for the last like decade. And before that, it dropped a lot. Okay, so not standardizing for population growth is an easy way to trick people who aren't paying attention, but I know you guys can look for that. Now, there are more subtle ways. Sometimes people will pretend to be giving context to statistics by making comparison to other statistics. And I saw this one specifically in the COVID thing. And it really made me angry because you have to always be careful when you make an analogy or a comparison that you are comparing apples to apples, not apples to oranges. And every analogy limps, is the old saying. So one of the things I heard, I remember the day they passed the number of deaths, past the number of that died in Vietnam. And that was all over the news. That's where every channel on the internet, it's all over the news. Like how more people, as of right now, have died from the coronavirus than died in all of the Vietnam War. And they were making it out like these things are analogous. But that's a terrible comparison. It's a terrible comparison for a lot of reasons. First of all, the average age of the people who died in Vietnam was probably like 20 or 25 at the most. They were kids who were drafted. That's the second part. They were drafted against their will to go fight a war they didn't want to fight. I mean, there's like no comparisons. And it doesn't even include the thousands of people, probably hundreds of thousands of people who came back scarred, both physically, mentally, without limbs. Just to take one stat, like the number that died in Vietnam and compare it to the number that died in COVID-19, and then say, oh my God, that really puts it into perspective. No, it doesn't. It doesn't put it into perspective at all. It takes it completely out of perspective. It's a terrible analogy for all those reasons I just said. A virus is a virus. It's a biological thing. It wasn't like a political war that we went to when drafted people to fight. There's a huge difference between those two things. So again, when they try to give context to things, a lot of times they don't succeed very well. And even when they give the correct statistics, it's often possible to make them look way scarier than they really are. For example, think about the EMF controversy, where we were told that there was an epidemic of male breast cancer patients among power line workers. It showed like a 200-fold increase. I forget what the number was, but it was some crazy increase, okay? Well, if you looked at the data, the actual study, there were 2 cases of male breast cancer. 2. And they weren't linemen, they were office workers. So on the basis of those 2 cases, there was an epidemic of, and that's the word, they used the word epidemic of male breast cancer among linemen. Isn't that crazy? I mean, it's not wrong. 2 is a huge number for men because men don't get it very often, right? So that does make it look like, but I mean, is that really a statistic? I mean, or is that probably just, happened to be unlucky to find, they weren't even linemen anyway. I mean, it's just crazy. You need to look for these statistical errors when you're doing your paper. You absolutely have to look for the manipulation. Sometimes it's intentional, sometimes it's not. It won't be easy to find. You'll have to search multiple sources on the internet. I've been doing that. I've been doing a little research on this stuff myself, and I've been finding stuff out that is really shocking to me. There are lots of ways that they can use to correct statistics to still scare you in an unwarranted way. All right, one of the ones I found just recently, you see all this time, I'm showing you some right now popping up, these exponential curves, which look really, really scary. And of course, they're all correct. There's nothing wrong with that. And we keep being told that we're going to flatten the curve. But if you look at the numbers they're talking about, and you guys are waiting for that curve to flatten, if you're looking for that bell-shaped curve, you're never going to see it. What do you mean you're not going to see it? Well, not with those numbers. If you're just looking at total number of cases or total number of deaths, you realize that that number will never drop. People don't come back from the grave, and the people who are tested positive don't then test negative. Those numbers are only going one direction, up and eventually leveling off. They will never drop back down like the bell-shaped curve that you see say, oh, we got to flatten that curve. But they're 2 different curves. So those scary exponential growth of the deaths and number of cases are never going to become the bell-shaped curve. What will become a bell-shaped curve are the total number of daily cases or daily deaths. That will eventually drop, okay? So they will love to show you the really, really scary exponential growth, and it sure looks like it's still going up, when in fact, that number is never coming down. Think about it. The number of deaths is never going to be less than it is today. It'll only be more, or flat. And once it's flat, it'll stay the same forever. Okay, once the whole thing's gone. And unfortunately, they try to use those numbers to say, hey, look, the curve's not flat yet. We can't reopen. We can't go anywhere. Hide under your bed until that curve comes back down. But like I said, it's never coming back down. All right, what you need to look at is what I show you in this graph here. And that's the number of daily cases. And you almost never see this because what you see is the bar graph that still looks like it's kind of going up, right? I mean, that bar graph, which is of, the positive tests and the daily tests are rising. And the number of positive cases rose very dramatically when we started testing more. There's no surprise there. There were fewer cases when we were testing less. There's more cases that we're testing more, right? So that's not what we should be looking at. That's not going to determine whether we actually qualify to go into reopening phases. What should determine whether we go into reopening phases for reopening the government and reopening the stores is the number of or the percentage of daily cases. And if you look at that graph, that's the line. And you'll see that that graph has been dropping steadily for some time. Okay? So when they try to scare you with, these numbers aren't wrong. The number that they're showing you are not incorrect. But they're way scarier than the line that you see that's been dropping steadily. Actually, dropping steadily since April. Okay? I mean, and that's the actual number that is going to eventually determine when we get to the reopening phases. I mean, according to that graph, okay, assuming that's correct, we've been dropping for some time. All right? And you say, well, how come, we had such, the other bar graphs still look so scary? How come those numbers are still going up? Well, there's a couple of reasons for that. Like I said, people don't come back from the grave. So if they show you graphs of how many people died, that's never coming down, like the other line graph. You have to keep that in mind. And number two is as we test more, we're obviously finding more cases. Okay? We've now tested more than any other country. Actually, when I understand, all other countries combined. Clearly, we are going to find more cases that were hidden in those other countries. It's going to look like America had way more cases than everybody else. But how true is that? Do you really believe that that's true? Where China, where it started, and has a population like 3 times our size, only had the number of cases as New Jersey. I mean, that doesn't seem to make a whole lot of sense. All right. But it's easy to scare you with statistics. And that's why you have to look at other sources. You have to not just take as gospel truth what you're seeing from one specific source, one scary source. Okay. And never challenge that. You have to challenge those sources. So I looked at the H1N1 virus, which you probably know as a swine flu. Okay. The swine flu hit around 2009. There was basically a pandemic. It was across the globe as well. And imagine my shock to learn the number of cases of swine flu in the United States. There are over 60 million cases in the United States. Now, I don't know how many COVID there are right now, or they're gonna end up being. I think there's probably a couple million right now, but it's nowhere near 60 million. In 1 year of the swine flu, there were 60 million Americans who were diagnosed with the swine flu. All right, we're nowhere near that number. All right, we may get there. I don't think so. I think we're obviously on our way down on the other side of the curve at this point, unless there's a huge spike and a huge resurgence in the fall and the winter. I don't think we'll get there, but I don't know. I mean, that's why when you're in the middle of something, you really don't know. But 60 million is not even close to the number of cases we have right now. And by the way, that's from the CDC. That is not some alt-right conspiracy nut with a tinfoil hat in his basement. All right. And you know how many deaths there were worldwide? There were 200 to 500,000. They really don't know the exact number. So the CDC says between 200 and 500 and some thousand. Right now, if you actually believe the Chinese statistics, which I don't think anybody does, it's, again, not that high. It's pretty high, though. It's close to that, but it's not that high. And in America, we've, had about, for the H1N1, the swine flu in America, we had about 15,000 deaths. Okay? Well, we've had way more than that for COVID-19. We've had, at this point, like I said, talking to you right now, somewhere around 80,000 deaths. So it's clearly higher. Now, the strange thing about these statistics concerning the swine flu versus the COVID-19 is that even though 60 million people got that disease in America and 15,000 died from it that year. I don't remember this happening. I don't remember the country being shut down over it. Matter of fact, we did very little, all right, different in this country. You certainly don't remember it. I know you were only young, but I mean, I remember hearing about it, and maybe a few of you guys may remember hearing about it. You're pretty young, but it was not a complete shutdown of the country. Now, being a skeptic that I am, this is what you have to do in the paper. You cannot just say, oh, look, I found this stat, I'm going to run with it. I started looking for what's the argument against this, because there must be an argument. I figured somebody's got, I'm not that smart, somebody else has to know this. So I began to look up counter arguments, and they basically go like this. Yeah, the swine flu spread rapidly, but it was far less deadly than COVID-19. I mean, by orders of magnitude less deadly. In other words, your chances of dying from swine flu were way lower, like thousands and thousands of times less chance. Because remember, the initial mortality rate for when the China and Italy, from their numbers coming out, it was like 4.7%, which is really high. The other flus and stuff are like less than 1%, like 0.01% in some cases. But I realized even back then that these numbers really didn't add up. I mean, nobody really believed the Chinese numbers. I mean, the entire country of China, which is way bigger than America, according to them, had fewer cases than, like a lot fewer cases than New Jersey's had. I mean, nobody really believes that. And as I thought about that more and more, I realized that because they're not reporting that, but they kind of can't hide the dead bodies, so they kind of have to report how many people died, it makes the numbers look so much bigger. And that was compounded by the fact that in America, we were late testing. So it really looked early on like this was going to be the most deadly virus since 1918. But in fact, the more we've tested, the more we've realized this thing's been here for weeks, if not months, and millions of people have it. Had it before and have it now. And the vast majority didn't even know it or only had a very mild case of it. You say, well, what does that mean? Well, here's what that means. It's like, think of it this way. If to get a rate of death, you're going to have to take the number of people who died and divide it by the total number of cases. Well, the number of people who die, you can't change. You can't hide. Even China couldn't hide it. But the number of cases that you have are hidden two possible ways. Possibly deliberately, if you want to make yourself look good, or even without being deliberate, the fact that we didn't test. And didn't test early enough. Now, we're testing a lot now. And as we're testing more, the numbers are going through the roof. And you say that's a bad thing. No, it's a good thing. That's telling us that the denominator is getting way bigger. But the numerator is basically what it was. So when you divide that numerator by that bigger denominator, you get a much lower mortality rate. The mortality rate will be nowhere near, I could say this with confidence, it will be nowhere near the original predictions of 4.7%. It'll be less than 1%, like most viruses are. So, and by the way, this is a little biology. You should look at the first part. But viruses don't actually want to kill you. All right? I mean, viruses don't have a brain. But the fact is, it's not evolutionarily advantageous for them to kill their host immediately or to kill them at all. It's much better for them to have them be sick, pass that virus along to other hosts for a very long time. And that's why most viruses, although some are definitely deadly, and this one is definitely deadly. All right, it would be really surprising to find a virus that, it spreads as rapidly as it does, this one has, and is as deadly as it is. And that's why originally even I was thinking, like, this is really, if this is true, we're screwed, But luckily it turned out that it wasn't. Now, there's an even crazier thing that I'm going to bring up to you that I've seen nowhere. I only saw it because I was doing some research. I was looking online and looking for other things besides, other things about this H1N1 swine flu. And guess what I found? And I have not heard this on one single person's blog, internet, news program. And like I said, I watch a fair amount, even more now that I'm stuck in the house, right? And this is the crazy part about this. As I was doing this, I read something about the swine flu that was very surprising. As you all know, somewhere around 90% of all the deaths from COVID-19 have been for people over 75 or with severe underlying conditions. So old people, okay? 90%. Thankfully, you guys, the younger generation and children seem to be almost immune to this pandemic. All right, now that's good news. But what makes things interesting is that the exact opposite statistics were true for swine flu. And again, this never drove people crazy. We did not, hide under the bed for 3 months. Here's the opposite statistics on flu, which I only looked up by total accident. The elderly in the swine flu epidemic were pretty much immune. 80% of the deaths from swine flu were people under the age of 65. Children, mostly. Young people. Pretty amazing. The theory was that older people were probably, at some time in their very long lives, exposed to a similar virus to that swine flu. And so they had developed some kind of antibodies that were still there, and they protected them a little bit. But children didn't have that. They hadn't been around long enough to develop that immunity. And they died. They died by 80%. Now imagine the difference. I mean, that's that's like, if COVID-19 were doing that, all right, it would be very difficult to not justify what we've been doing, because the elderly population is a small population that's already pretty much self-isolated. It would have been possible to isolate them better and not isolate the entire world, shutting down every school, okay? If it really were everyone under 65 that were at risk, then what we're doing here would probably make complete sense, all right? But it turns out that it's not. And in the end, this is the crazy kicker of it all right? And it's going to get a little morbid here when I start talking about this, but you have to look at the numbers this way. I do sometimes. You have to do this. If it's true, now again, all these things that we know about COVID can change. I'm not saying these are written in stone, but if it's true that only about 10% of all COVID deaths are young people, and on the flip side, about 80% of the swine flu deaths from 2009 were young people, COVID-19 may actually kill pretty much the same number. Even though there's way more deaths right now from COVID-19 than there were from the swine flu, it may actually kill the same number of children by either virus. Do the math. All you got to do, multiply 0.1, 10%, times our number right now, somewhere around 80,000. It's going to be about 8,000. And multiply 0.8 by the 15,000 or so that died from the swine flu in America. You're going to get similar numbers. I know ours is going to continue to rise. All right. I know we're in the middle of this thing and it's not over yet. And I'm not sure how things are going to shake out, but it's very likely that even the swine flu, which we didn't even shut anything down over, may have killed the same number or even more children than COVID-19 ever will. Now you say, well, that's where I'm saying it's going to get a little morbid. Now, me bringing this up does not make me a monster. I don't want old people to die. Okay? I mean, in a pandemic like this, we have to realize we are really lucky that this virus is not affecting children the way most viruses and flus do. And to be completely honest, something that kills you at 90 years of age is simply not as tragic as something that kills you at 9 years of age or 9 months. That may sound callous, and no one on TV or the internet's ever going to say it. Oh my God, a life is a life. I know that. I'm quite aware. I would not kill my mother. I don't want her to die from this just because she's old. That's not what I'm saying. My point is, this really could have been way worse for two reasons. One is, old people who have lived their lives, I don't think anyone, if you stopped for a minute and took a step back, would say that a 90-year-old dying of old age or dying of coronavirus is as sad or as tragic as a 9-year-old dying of coronavirus. I don't think anybody would make that argument. It may sound cruel. No one's going to make that argument because it sounds like a calculus you don't want to do. But it's a fact, all right? That is basically a fact. And the second part, like I said earlier, the fact that it's older people makes it easier to isolate. They're already pretty much self-isolated. I mean, how much do your great-grandparents or grandparents go out? I mean, they go to eat breakfast probably with their friends at the White Horse Diner, and that's about it. They sit around and watch TV all day. Or they're in a nursing home already, so they could have been isolated. If it were up to me, we would have sent the National Guard out in front of every rest home, tested every single person that went in, blocked it off any unnecessary people to go in, and that's kind of what not the National Guard part, but it's kind of what Sweden did. They didn't shut the country down. They basically just isolate. They used better hygiene and they social distance. But restaurants were open, retail stores were open, all right, and they didn't shut the country down, but they did try to protect their elderly population better, and they didn't really have much higher rates than any of the other European countries around them. Now, you can't compare Sweden to the United States. We have a much denser population. We have way more people. I know that, all right? But the problem is, I'm willing to admit that no matter what happens here, we'll never know the truth. We'll never know that if we had not done what we did it the other way, would we have had a lot more people die? Now, this is what I can't stand about people on the internet. People on the internet who are so cocksure that there's no doubt in my mind, if we hadn't done this, we would have killed millions of people. I know I can't prove that if we had done it my way, the way I'm saying right now, that we wouldn't have, more people could have died. I don't know, but I don't think so. I don't think it would have been a big difference. I think if we had protected the elderly population, the most vulnerable population, people with comorbidities, which is basically underlying conditions, all right? But, you'll never convince these people. They'll just think that you're Hitler, I had to bring Hitler up because you always bring him up in the thing. You're just a monster for thinking this way. But in fact, in the end, we have to look at the unintended consequences of all that we are doing. All right, but these people, they believe the models, even when they're wrong all the time.